You, you may now take your seats. Okay. Okay. We would like to acknowledge the presence of the following guests: the descendants of former President Elpidio Quirino, Miss Ruby Quirino Gonzalez, okay, Miss Aleli Quirino, Chinita Quirino Abad, Suzanne G. Yupanco from the Filipinas Heritage Library of the Ayala Foundation, Mrs. Emelita Almosara, former Executive Director of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts and also of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, Mr. Wensley Reyes, the incoming Associate Dean of the Faculty of Behavioral and Social Sciences of the Philippine Normal University, and also to our Associate Dean of the Faculty of the Behavioral Science and Social Science of PNU, Professor Florisa Simeon, Honorable Jerty Tirona, Undersecretary of the Commission of Filipino Overseas, and also Ms. Minerva Brillante of the University Events Management and Public Relations Office of the Philippine Normal University. And last but not the least, our guest speaker for this lecture, Dr. Jaime C. Laya, former Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas Governor and Chairman of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. Okay. Okay, this lecture that we are having this afternoon at the Philippine Normal University is the third lecture series in commemoration of Elpidio Quirino's 125th birth anniversary. And it was launched or had a kick-off last April, commenced by a lecture delivered by Professor Solita Monsod, Maring Winnie Monsod, at GT Toyota Asian Center at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. And the topic of Mrs. Maring Winnie was the economy and polity during President Quirino's time. And it was followed by a lecture last 25th of June by Mr. Bernard Kerblat from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, because if you, kung matatandaan po ninyo, it was our government during 2 years after the war who accommodated or welcomed the refugees from China, the so-called White Russians, diba? White Russians, because we have this, culture that lahat ng mapuputi tinatawag nating Amerikano, but these are White Russians. These were anti-communist national that were that transferred to China, and eventually when the communist China take over the government, they were expelled to China, and we are the only country in the whole world who accepted these refugees. And that was the topic of Mr. Kerblat last June 25th. And for this afternoon, we will be our guest speaker will lecture about the education during the time of President Elpidio Quirino. And it is very special because this particular lecture for President Quirino is being held here at the Philippine Normal University, our foremost national center for teaching education in the country. And for us, scholars of history, President Quirino was so special to us because during his incumbency, he instructed all the public school teachers in the country to document the local history of every town and province in the country. And it is now this is now what constitutes the so-called historical data papers at the National Library of the Philippines. He was the president who issued an order to document every history and culture of every town in the country. Because after the war, there was this collection of local history in the country that was part of the what we call nasira after the war. So to replace those materials that were obliterated by the war, so President Quirino issued an order. Hopefully, I am not preempting the lecture of Dr. Laya. So, to proceed to our program, may we call on Professor Florisa Simeon, the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Behavioral Science, Faculty of Behavioral and Social Science of PNU.
A pleasant afternoon to all. To our distinguished guests for today's celebration of the 125th birth anniversary of President Elpidio Quirino, Dr. Jaime C. Laya, the trustee of President Elpidio Quirino Foundation, Ms. Emelita V. Almozara, the president of the foundation, Attorney Aleli Angela G. Quirino, the descendants, to our moderator, guests, university officials, my colleagues, academic staffs, students, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the university president, Dr. Esther B. Ojena, welcome to Philippine Normal University. I would like to thank the President Quirino Foundation for choosing PNU as one of the venues of this lecture series. For this is a wonderful occasion and opportunity to hear a great story about our public education, where PNU is a known institution for providing it for our country, especially after the rehabilitation of our country in World War II. As history teacher, I consider World War II as one of the lowest point in our history. And looking back, how would you picture Manila in the midst of destruction and despair during that time? Especially our main campus, PNU. When you enter the campus of PNU, you're actually entering a monument. It's not just a building, it's a functional building for PNU ones. And I think including the College of Education building, we're lucky enough that we're actually occupying these two magnificent buildings here inside the campus. And at the same time, it witnessed the destruction of World War II. Knowing the proximity of PNU just across the old legislative building and the Manila City Hall, wherein you'll be seeing the clock tower of Manila City Hall, almost totally destroyed. But the campus of PNU, I think, I spared during that nightmare. But after the war, rehabilitation and reconstruction came in. The Filipino people displayed resiliency and courage to move forward. And President Quirino exerted effort to bring this country from the ashes and rubble of war. For that, he earned the title, the father of Philippine industrialization. Aside from this industrialization, education system was immediately reinstalled. And PNU, or PNS during that time, contributed so much for the demands of professional teachers during that time. And before the program started, we just crossed the archives across this hall, and we read the Republic Act 416 on June 18, 1949, where President Quirino inked a Republic Act making PNS, Philippine Normal School, to PNC, Philippine Normal College, and of course, currently PNU. So, knowing that we're going to hear a great story, it's really my honor to have this kind of activity here in the university. And we're so happy to have our guest speaker that we're going to witness how it is or how it was during that time. And isang magandang opportunity para sa akin personally to hear at makita mismo yung isang tao na nakikita ko lamang dati sa mga libro at sa mga pera na ngayon ay nandito siya sa atin. Para sa mga kabataan na magiging guro at sa mga guro at malay nyo, isa rin sa inyo ay maging pangulo ng ating bansa. Sana ay makinig tayo ng maayos at ating namnamin ang mga kaisipan na makukuha natin sa hapon na ito. Maraming salamat po at sana kayo ay manatili sa buong programa. Salamat.
Maraming salamat po, Professor Florisa Simeon. Ayun po. Ayun po. And, okay, to introduce our guest lecturer this afternoon, may we call on Ms. Amelita Almosara, trustee of the President Elpidio Quirino Foundation.
Thank you, Ian. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm deeply honored with this role I'm taking in this afternoon's program by way of introducing our guest lecturer, Dr. Jaime del Carmen Laya, or JCL. He has a long list of credentials. Let me cite a few. He is a man of distinction, a highly regarded technocrat, not only during his active years in government service, but up to the present. He has distinguished himself in the fields of economics, banking and finance management, accounting and budgeting, education, arts and heritage promotion and preservation. He exemplified himself in handling several positions in government as budget minister, central bank governor, minister of education and culture, administrator of the Intramuros administration, chairman of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, and trustee of the Cultural Center of the Philippines. As a multifaceted man with refined intellectual and artistic taste, Dr. Laya continuously and indefatigably plays major roles in the society. He is a prolific newspaper columnist and book writer. He is the chairman of the Escuela Taller de Filipinas Foundation Incorporated, which trains young Filipino artisans and craftsmen to work on the restoration of heritage buildings and structures. And he is also the chairman of the board and president of Philtrust Bank. Referred to as a culture champ, he is an avid and enthusiastic collector of archival materials, books, maps, prints, manuscripts, pre-Hispanic gold, ethnic weaves, paintings, santos, rebultos, potteries, furniture, jewelry, ceramics, among others. Name it, and he has it for sure. Dr. Laya's parents were both teachers, and I suspect that both of them came from the Philippine Normal School or products of PNS. I'm not very sure. One, si Laya and Silvina del Carmen. He was well-oriented and inspired to become an educator himself. He graduated magna cum laude in business administration in UP, acquired master's degree in industrial management from Georgia Institute of Technology, and his PhD from the Stanford Graduate School of Business in California. He taught accounting, economics, and management courses at UP, and later rose to the rank of Professor of Accounting and Director of Graduate Studies at UP College of Business Administration and later became Dean of the same college. He was the founder and chair of Laya Mananghaya Company and has been part of several private institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Manila, Fundación Santiago, ABS-CBN Foundation Incorporated, Dangal ng Bulacan Foundation, Cofradia de la Inmaculada Concepcion, among others. Dr. Laya's role in heritage preservation and promotion, both here and abroad, was duly recognized with the award bestowed upon him, the Orden del Mérito Civil, with the high rank of Commander, and Encomienda de Número by King Juan Carlos I of Spain and the Spanish government through then Spanish Ambassador to the Philippines, His Excellency Jorge Domecq. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me that I take pride in presenting to you the man I personally highly regard for his lecture this afternoon, Dr. Jaime C. Laya.
Thank you very much, Director Almosara, for the very kind words. Actually, Meli is one of a government official that I admire the most. She was unquestionably one of the best officials I encountered during my years in government. She also taught me I think a very important lesson, which is not to yield to pressure in the face of political interference. One time when I was chairman of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, there was this group that wanted to oust me. And it was actually a group of librarians. And NCCA is supposed to be by voting, and I would have been ousted had it not been for Mrs. Almosara. And not that I really wanted to stay on. I suppose it was a matter of pride more than anything else, but I've never forgotten that. Mrs. Mayor and the members of the Quirino family, our distinguished guests, members of government, the officials of Philippine Normal University and the students and faculty members of the university, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I was actually very thankful, not at first, but on second thought. On second thought, I was very thankful for having been invited to this meeting because it offered me the chance of reviewing and refreshing myself of the many things that I heard as a kid and which I never paid attention to. As Mrs. Almosara mentioned, my parents were both school teachers. My father was a teacher of English. He taught at Mapa High School for many years, and he joined the Department of Education. And after the war in 1945, he was picked to reopen the high schools of Manila. And so he opened the Manila High School, etc. So he was the first principal of the Manila High School after the war, and the first principal also of Arellano High School. And it allowed me to remember those days. He then became Assistant Superintendent of Pangasinan and then Superintendent of Bataan. And he talked about many things that, as a kid, I never really paid attention to, but which now I realize was one of the major activities of the Department of Education, one of the major initiatives of President Elpidio Quirino. And I was glad that I am now able to familiarize myself with it and to share the things that happened 50, 60 years ago. Now I'd like to divide my presentation into 5 areas. Maybe I'd better angle myself so I can see what I'm talking about. First, a little background, and then to review education policy during the Quirino years, namely 1949 to 1953. And it just happens that those were my years in elementary, high school, and my first year in college. So I'd like to describe basically how it felt to be a student, to be the beneficiary of the policies that were designed at the national level, and then the outcomes, and finally a few thoughts concerning education for the 21st century. First, on the background. Population was rather small at that time, 20 million, about 1/5 of the present population. And the total school population was about 4.8 million, most of which was in the public schools and only a fraction in the private schools, mainly in higher education, because the bulk of the students in the public schools were in the grade schools and in the secondary schools. There was a big jump in enrollment in 1945, 1946, because many students did not attend school during the Japanese occupation, so they caught up during when schools reopened in 1945. And in fact, many of my classmates were about 6 or 7 years older than me because they were the ones who who were catching up from the years that they missed. Now, the education enrollment was like this. As I said, most of the private school enrollment was in the secondary and collegiate levels. There's a little bit of mismatch in the statistics because of the timing, but anyway, practically all the elementary school students were in public schools, and the same I think was true for the intermediate grades, less so in the secondary schools. Now, the education time horizon is, as you will understand, a long one. Whatever policies are adopted in education do not really take effect until perhaps 30, 40 years later. The effect is not immediate, which is why it was a little difficult, a little challenging to try to discuss exactly what happened and what was the impact of the education measures taken during the Quirino administration, which was, as I mentioned, 1948 to 1953, less than 5 years, actually. And, this is actually my, you might say, my biography already. I graduated elementary school in 1949, so I was 1 year, grade 6, during the term of President Quirino. All my high school years were during the Quirino administration, And my first year in college, likewise, was in the Quirino administration. So you might say that I was one of the immediate beneficiaries of education during the term of President Elpidio Quirino. Now, later on, needless to say, whatever I learned in high school and in grade school carried me through college and through graduate school, because were it not for that education, I would never have been admitted to schools in the United States. And in all modesty, I didn't fare too badly in both my MA and PhD courses. You might say that because of the education that I received in the public school system, grade school, high school, and college, all public schools, allowed me to really compete more than evenly with my classmates at Georgia Tech and at Stanford. The only difference that I remember was that here, I didn't have to study too much and be at the top of the class. But there, I had to study, the hardest I ever studied, and I was simply average. A little bit above average, actually. But anyway, the point is, the education in the Philippines Philippine public schools was more than adequate preparation to compete internationally. Now, after education, then of course, that's when I started my working career. First in education, then subsequently in the public service, and then professional practice, which is, as Mrs. Almasara mentioned, accounting and auditing. And I started it after 1986. With 3 employees, one of whom was a former maid at home. And when I retired in 2004, we were about 350 people, and number 3 in the accounting profession. After SGV and after Joaquin Cunanan and Company, it was already my firm, which was the 3rd. And I retired from public practice in 2004, and so now I do managerial as well as advisory board on boards of directors of both corporations as well as NGOs. And my point in illustrating this is really the fact that the term of President Quirino was 48 to 53, and the impact of education policy during those years were not felt until, you might say, 1966 and onwards, which is, 16 years after the end of his term. And so whatever you do now here in the education system, the impact will similarly be 20, 30 years from now. You never see the results, whether good or bad, until way into the future. Now, the education policy has evolved over the years. We tend to think, or we assume, that Philippine public education began with the Thomasites. No, that's not true. We had Philippine public education during the Spanish regime, in fact, beginning in 1863, just 1 or 2 years after Spain herself introduced public education, and just a few years after France, England, even the US. We were not too delayed in terms of introducing public education. Now, during those years, education was basically limited to reading, writing, and arithmetic, and to basic skill, and to religion. It was very religion-centered, and also to basic skills. In the case of girls, they were taught sewing, embroidery, cooking, keeping basic accounts, tenants' debts, and all that. That was the extent of the education they got. Now, in the case of the boys, they were taught carpentry and other similar skills, which I assume did not make too much of an impact because the boys were described then as gamblers, cockfighters, and so on. So they probably didn't like gardening or whatever. So it was the girls that were more industrious. Now, during the American regime and the government, the education system was, and by the way, during the Spanish regime, Spanish was also taught in the schools, although I suppose the students really didn't learn that much. But anyway, during the American regime, English became the medium of instruction. Education was given great emphasis. More schools were constructed. And the focus was on governance, because the the announced policy was that the Philippines was being prepared for independence, and so emphasis in the schools was given to citizenship, to how government was run, and other things, and definitely not on religion. Science, geography, language were given great emphasis. And during those days, education was, population was low, and so education was basically a limited system. There was only one elementary school per town, and there was only one high school per province. So when students wanted to go to high school, they actually had to move to the provincial capital. And then universities were also very few. UP, Filipino Normal School, and vocational schools. And so in the case of my father, he moved to Lingayen. He was from Pangasinan. So he moved to Lingayen when he was 13 or 14 years old. And then he moved to Manila when he was 18. That's how schools were. And even in Metro Manila, there were only 4 high schools during those times. Manila North, which was Arellano High School, Manila South, which was Araulio, Manila East, which was Mapa, and Manila North, which was Torres High School. There were only 4 high schools during those times. Now, during the Japanese occupation, you might be surprised, the education system was oriented towards nationalism. In fact, the books were all censored. And so pages were cut off from, for example, the readers, and the pages having to do with the United States, etc. They were all trimmed, they were all cut off, pages were pasted together because, the Japanese authorities didn't want to have any reminder of the enemy, namely the Americans, and they placed greater emphasis on things national. In fact, they gave greater emphasis to Tagalog in addition to the Japanese language. Now, when independence came in 1945, the focus first was on taking care of the backlog, rehabilitating what was destroyed during liberation, and the reopening and the rehabilitation of school facilities. Many schools were destroyed during the war, and so that was the initial focus, taking care in particular of the backlog of students who were trying to catch up on schools. So now, education policy in 1948 to 53, during the administration of President Quirino, there was an effort to revamp the education system. So an education bill was proposed, And among other things, it had wanted to revive grade 7. There was grade 7 during most of the American period, but during the Commonwealth, grade 7 was abolished. They wanted to reinstate it during the Quirino administration. Unfortunately, the Congress did not agree, and so it's only now, 2015, 65 years, no, 70 years after the idea that grade 7 is being revived. Now, the traditional stress all during the American period was book learning and also dictation from top to bottom. Everything was designed in Manila, and practically day-by-day lessons were the same throughout the country because teachers were required to follow specific lessons. They were required to prepare lesson plans, and they had to be consistent with instructions. So the new thrust during the Quirino administration was the so-called community school system. I think most of us have forgotten about this, but it was a revolutionary concept that was introduced during that time. So instead of focus being given only to students, to learning, to book learning, the idea was for schools to be the catalyst for community development. So the general idea was that schools and school teachers would be the tool for the improvement of democratic living in their respective community, which, as you will understand, was a completely revolutionary concept. Before, the focus was on the child. They wanted to teach him reading, writing, arithmetic, science, etc., music, what have you. The idea now is to take advantage of the position of the schools so that the school system would become an important element of community and eventually national development. The experiment started in Iloilo and Bataan, as well as Bulacan and 3 or 4 other provinces were the leaders in the community school movement. And my father happened to be the president of, or rather the school superintendent of Bataan at that time. And that's why I heard, even as a kid, community school, little democracies, etc., which never really sunk in until I was preparing for this afternoon's discussion. Now, in Santa Barbara, which was really the leader of this movement, the Poblacion was considered as an educational unit. And in the case of Bataan, they organized what they called purok, groups of 30 to 50 families. And so it was a formal organization, you might say. It's really the precursor of our present barangay system, with a barangay captain and with a barangay council, except during that time, the teacher was supposed to be the leader, because the teacher was one of the most respected people in all communities. They were, they were known for incorruptibility, they were known for idealism, they were known for their capability in leadership. You know how teachers are. They know how to give orders. They know when to scold. They know when to cajole. They know when to flatter. They also know when to retreat, I suppose. So anyway, they were recognized as the leaders during that time. And so they were assigned the role of, we call it now, convener. And so they were supposed to organize the people, call them to meetings, etc. And they were supposed to facilitate the election of the formation of a community organization, which, as I said, in Bataan, they call them purok, they call them something else elsewhere. But the whole idea was that the school was the center of development. And so the objective of that organization was to identify the needs of that particular community, the 30 to 50 families, the poblacion, etc., and see to the implementation. It was entirely self-help. They were not supposed to ask for PDAF. They were not supposed to it was supposed to be entirely funded and by the community, mainly in physical labor, physical contributions, contributions in kind also, but definitely not money from a central pocket. And so this was reinforced, the effort was reinforced by surveys, by resource visitors, by demonstrations, service projects, as well as coordination with other agencies. So in effect, the teacher and the school played an important role in this particular effort. Okay, so now these are some of the projects that were universally basically adopted. So in terms of economic security, the teachers and the members of the community organization encouraged people to put up home gardens, vegetable gardens, as well as ornamental plants, poultry, piggery, improved farming, like in I think in Iloilo. They taught people to increase the harvest of mango trees through smudging. So they went even to the extent of essentially agricultural extension work. They also encouraged home industries like basket weaving, etc. And in some places, they actually put up stores to sell the product. And so these home industries were supposed to be done during the slack season between planting and harvesting of palay in the case of the palay growing regions of the country. So depending on the needs of the community, the preferences of the people, the resources available, many of them went into economic security. They also focused on health and sanitation. I suppose few of you ever heard of the commune in the provinces. The nipa huts were usually twins. So you had a nipa hut, they had a batalan, the open area behind, and there was a bridge to a little hut, about 20 feet away, and that was the toilet of the household. There was no water. It was simply a hole in the floor. And more often than not, the area below was unfenced. And I'll just share a little secret between us girls. But during the Japanese occupation, when I was, I think, about 3 or 4 years old, we evacuated to my cousins in Pangasinan, rather in Bulacan. I also have Bulacan cousins. And there was such a commune. And one of my favorite pastimes was target practice because there was a pig down below. And more often than not, I hit the bullseye. So anyway, that was the norm in terms of sanitation during those days, and communities this was one of the things that the community school addressed, to have proper toilets in homes. And then drainage was also rather casual, because the Batalan, usually you had a well, that's where they did their bathing, their washing clothes, washing dishes, and there was no drainage. And so as a result, mosquitoes and what have you grew in those places. So, this was one of the things that was also addressed by the community schools. Cultural and social betterment. They paid attention to literacy classes, organized reading centers, revived folk dances as an alternative to cockfighting, for example. I don't know how successful that was, but at least they made an effort. And then citizenship and civic training. Rights and obligations of citizenship, namely voting, do not sell your vote, pay taxes, observe the law, etc., etc. So these were the four major areas that community schools eventually went into. Now, my own grade school experience, I actually do not know how grade schools are at the present time, but in 1945, I was put into grade 3, and so in 1948, I was grade 5, 1949, I was grade 6. This was in Alejandro Albert Elementary School. You might know it. It's in Dapitan. It's still there. Classes were in English. We used the American regime textbooks, and we were taught to sing the U.S. national anthem, and even the Philippine national anthem was in English. I don't know if too many of you know the English version. I never even learned the Tagalog version of our national anthem until I was already an adult. But instead of singing Bayang Magiliw, we would sing Land of the Morning, Child of the Sun Returning, etc. So that was elementary school during those days. And every so often, I think once a year, we went to, we all learned some calisthenics, and all of the elementary schools of Manila gathered to Rizal Memorial Stadium, the football field, and we had that field day, and we had gardening. In fact, I passed by Albert Elementary School recently. There's no more space for gardening, but before the school was only on Dapitan with one small wing. And the rest of it, all the way to P. Margal, was vacant land. And in grade 5 and grade 6, we were each assigned a plot. And we were taught fertilization, crop rotation, etc., etc. So we grew corn one semester, and then peanuts the next semester, and then cabbage, etc. And the trouble was water. There was only, there were only 2 or 3 faucets. And so we actually got the water from the canal in the street behind. But the canal then was okay. I mean, none of us really got sick. So it must have been okay. So that was one of the major experiences, and it actually served me in good stead. Because even now, I like gardening. Now, as was mentioned earlier, there used to be entrance examinations, I don't know if there still is, for high school. And the graduates of Albert Elementary School were supposed to go to Arellano High School. As I said, there were only 4 high schools in Manila. And so the elementary schools in one area were all supposed to go to a particular school. But then we had to take an entrance examination. And I was only 9 years old at that time, 1949, when we took the examination. And so my father was rather worried that I might flunk the entrance exam. So he had a plan B. And the plan B was Ateneo. So he actually took me to Ateneo, which was then located on Padre Faura. And he took me to see the classroom, etc. And basically he told me that, don't worry because, well, he didn't say so directly, but if you're not good enough for the Arellano Public High School, at least you can come here to Ateneo, which is not too bad. Look, it's okay. Well, anyway, I passed the Arellano entrance exam. And I keep on telling this to my Ateneo friends. They don't believe it, but it's true. Because during those days, La Salle, Ateneo, etc., were considered to be the schools of the lazy rich. Yeah, really. Really. So anyway, I was in Ateneo for 4 years. And this was entirely during the Quirino administration already. Now, our textbooks were a combination of pre-war and new textbooks because the Department of Education had been commissioning the writing of textbooks. So while we, our English classes still use the American textbooks. So even now, I kind of remember Annabel Lee. We memorized those. Annabel Lee, Lochinvar, we even took up Beowulf, O Captain, My Captain. All of those were part of our curriculum. Although in Tagalog, we already had Tagalog books. There were also, the economics book was also written by a Filipino, Andres Castillo, economics book, and in Tagalog, we took up literature, Diwang Kayo Manggi, which happened to be written by my father. He edited it, compiled it, and edited it, actually. And so we used a combination of those books. So one of the highlights of my high school days was in the 3rd year. And our class, and I suspect other classes in other Manila high schools, were taken here to Philippine Normal School. I think, must have been a college already. Philippine Normal College, to that auditorium in the old building. Diba sa 2nd floor, I don't know if it's still there, is an auditorium. And we watched The Merchant of Venice. That was my first Shakespeare play. It was acted by normal school students, and the audience was high school students. So it was simultaneously a lesson in acting on the part of the teachers, drama presentation, and a lesson in Shakespeare and drama appreciation on the part of students. So that was really one of the highlights of my high school years. I don't know if you still do it, but it was an excellent experience. Now, social studies then, as well as English classes, were very innovative. Like our English 2nd year class, and I suspect this must have been standard in all schools, had a homeroom session once a week. And so we had, that's where we learned Robert's Rules of Order, writing agendas, motions, seconding, declaring out of order, privileged, etc., etc. That was a great experience. And in another class, we learned about negotiable instruments, writing checks, promissory notes, etc. And one other very interesting experience, I'm sure you don't do this anymore, was how to write telegrams. Because during those days, if you wanted to, we had no email, we had no telex, there was no fax, so you had to send a telegram. And since they charged by the word, you had to be brief. So it tended to be money needed, send soon. Tatay, patay, uwi. That kind of thing. It had to be short because you didn't want to spend too much money. And anyway, that was, I thought, a very valuable experience in my case because that's when I learned how to edit. So instead of being wordy, I think I wrote much better because of that little experience. We also had, during those days, the YMCA was very active. So every year end, between Christmas and New Year, the YMCA organized a conference, the high school YMCA conference, which was held in Baguio. And each high school sent, maybe half a dozen students. So it was our chance to meet other student leaders in Manila. Our first exposure, my first exposure anyway, to real conferences, discussions, and all that. Unfortunately, during those days, YMCA was considered to be a subversive Protestant organization. So for 1 or 2 years, we were all excommunicated by the Catholic Church, actually. So that was also 1951-52. Now the school, high school, this was Arellano High School, had all kinds of extracurricular activities. So we had oratorical contests, choral competitions, journalism class. We even had a research and philatelic society. I think I was the only one interested in collecting stamps. So I got elected chairman of the Research and Philatelic Society. We actually never met because nobody wanted to attend. But anyway, it was a nice experience as well. Our advisor was the librarian of the school, which happened to be si Doña Josefa Marcos, the mother of President Marcos. So she was a very strict librarian. You could not open your mouth in the library. But anyway, she was my advisor during those days. We had a large library at Arellano, and it was sexually segregated. It was a large room. All the boys were here, and all the girls were there. So I don't think I ever stepped foot at all on the girls' side. Okay, so I guess those were the highlights of high school, my high school anyway, during the Quirino administration. Admission then at UP was, not as difficult as it is now. As long as you were an honors student, you were automatically admitted without having to take an entrance examination. There were entrance scholars. And so during my first semester, I think I paid about 90 pesos as tuition fee for the entire semester, which is a far cry from what it is now. Now, the outcome of all of this, 6 years of public school, elementary, 4 years of high school, this happened to be the lineup of the top performers of my high school. Alejandro Santos was our valedictorian. He decided to take up medicine and go back to his native city, Naga City, where he ended up to be, a very highly regarded cardiac surgeon. Our salutatorian became an executive of Petron. Jerry Sikat was our first honor. UP professor, NEDA Director General, World Bank official. Yours truly was second honor. And our third honor was Loretta Macashar, who eventually became Mrs. Sikat. She also became a UP professor. And my point here is that being a public school student during those days, really, I think to some extent, well, anyway, I guess to put it negatively, was not a hindrance to success and making a contribution in later years. And so all of these things happened 20, 30 years after graduating from high school. And so the impact of the Quirino years were really felt during the 1970s, 1980s, 90s, even up to the present time. I thought the story of Mr. Hilario Davide Sr. was very appropriate. He was born in 1904 in a mountain barrio of Argao, 18 kilometers from the town center. And so to go to elementary school and high school, he walked the 18 kilometers. There was no road. He walked the 18 kilometers every Sunday, stayed in town during the week, and then walked the other 18 kilometers back to his home every Friday. And he became an elementary school teacher, principal, district supervisor. He was district supervisor during the Quirino administration, and he was an important participant in the community school movement during those days, because I suppose it was the community school movement that co-opted his predilection, because he wanted to plant trees. That was his trip to reforest. So he kept on planting trees wherever he was, fruit trees, forest trees, etc. And so in fact, reforestation was cited by the Cebu school authorities as one of the important projects of the community school movement during those days, and no doubt it was because of Mr. Hilario Davide Sr.'s activities. And the interesting thing is that in 1985, when I was Minister of Education, I was invited to Colawin to inaugurate a science and reading center, and the building was built using the wood of the trees that Mr. Davide planted in 1949. So I thought that was a very apt illustration of the long-term impact of education. You never see the result. You never see the result of the trees until, in this particular case, practically 30 years later, when it became part of a school. And you could say that the impact of education lasts even more than 30, 50 years, maybe 100 years, because Mr. Davide Sr.'s son, June Davide, also was born in Colawin. By that time, his father was, I think, already principal or district supervisor. He went also to the public schools. During the Marcos administration, he was a leader of the opposition. He was the minority floor leader during the interim Batasang Pambansa. And eventually, he became Philippine ambassador to the United Nations, chairman of the Commission on Elections, and Chief Justice of the Philippines until 2005. So the seeds that were planted early after Second World War continues to be felt even at the present time. The same thing is true with Cesar Virata. His education was also entirely in the public schools. in Cavite. His father kept on getting moved here and there. He went to the Baguio Central School, UP Elementary School, UP High, and eventually graduated engineering and business at UP. He became dean of the UP College of Business Administration. I was the head of the management consultancy services at SGV, Minister of Finance for 16 years, Prime Minister for 5 years, and after 1986, a private sector leader. So again, the impact of education is very great, but it takes a long time to see how it is. In the case of the community school movement, I suppose eventually it died a natural death because it was replaced already by formal community organizations. The barangay captain, the barangay council, you have barangay halls all over. I don't know which is more effective. Though the old community school system under President Quirino, or the barangay system as it is implemented at the present time. I suspect that it was probably more visible, more effective in the old days than now when you really see the barangay captain only during election time. Now, what are the lessons for the future? We have an entirely different environment at the present time. The education system right now that we have is the cumulative result, cumulative impact of all of the measures taken all these years. The changes in curriculum, the forthcoming extension of the number of school years, the switch from medium of instruction from English to Tagalog and the local language, the changes in the perception with respect to public school teachers, the differences in pay between public school teachers and other professionals. Many changes have happened over the years, additional duties assigned to them. This is something that requires assessment. And the orientation is different from over the years. The orientation has been towards the home and individual, citizenship, community service, and more recently, orientation to a life of work. We never heard before of courses like English for BPOs. It was English. English is English. So this kind of orientation is relatively recent. And then the perception in terms of public and private schools, differences in type of teachers, quality of teachers, the course of study, the number of errors in approved textbooks, I suppose differ, the facilities, whatever they see in their environment, the TV shows that were non-existent before. So all of these are different. And the challenge is also different. Our challenge is the fact that the world is now open to liberalization. So far, there is liberalization in trade and investment. The next step is liberalization in service. The move is towards allowing, for example, foreign professionals to practice in the Philippines and vice versa. So the question is, how prepared are we, and how prepared is our education system to cope with all of this? Four of my grandchildren live abroad. So they study in schools in Singapore and in Spain. I look at their homework, and it's really a far cry from what our students learn here. So the kind of competition that our school system, our children are facing is really different now from what it was before. When I was Minister of Education, the benchmark was percentage improvement in the education from one year to another. You know, did they improve 3% from last year, or did they improve 0, or did they improve 10%, whatever it was. At that time, it was not even thought of how we were in comparison with schools in other countries. Maybe it was not relevant then because there was no liberalization, but now it is. And so we have to switch basis for comparison. So I think these are probably some of the things that we need to take into account when we look at education in the coming decades. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jaime C. Laya. Okay. Okay. Before we proceed to our open forum, okay, the Kislap Singing Dance Group of the Philippine Normal University has prepared a presentation for us. So allow me to read an excerpt of their abstract. Kislap Singing Dance Troupe of the Philippine Normal University is devoted in the preservation and promotion of Filipino traditions and culture through folk dance. Since its establishment in 1993, under its founder and artistic director, Dr. Larry A. Gabao, the group has been an ambassador of goodwill to various programs and activities of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, the Cultural Center of the Philippines, the Commission on Higher Education, Department of Education, the Department of Tourism, and the Civil Service Commission. And the title of their presentation this afternoon is a traditional ballroom dance from the province of Bohol, Mazurka Boholana. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Kislap Singing Dance Troupe. Okay, thank you very much, Kislap Sining Dance Group, for their Mazurka Boholana. So we shall now open the floor for the open forum. So may we ask a chair for Dr. Laya here at the stage. So, okay, kindly raise their hands for those who have questions or clarifications, rectifications about Dr. Laya's lecture.
Okay lang. Never mind.
Okay. So, ayun po, lumapit lang po sa akin yung may tanong. So, okay. Kindly raise your hands, okay?
Please don't feel obliged to ask a question.
Okay. Sa mga teachers natin dito sa NTC, NTC, sorry. PNU, sorry. Sorry, go. Kala-lecture ko lang kasi sa NTC noong nakaraan, sorry. Okay, Philippine Normal University, ayan. Naku, baka di ako makalabas dito. Okay. So, okay. Wag po tayo mahiya. Free po ang magtanong. Okay po? Sa likod po, ayun, si ma'am. Okay? Kindly state your name and institution.
Ayun, Jedeline Wenceslao po, third year BSc Social Science. So, nung time niyo po, what was the most significant contribution, yung pinaka-naaalala niyo po na na-contribute ni LP Joquerino sa education? Yung pinaka-naaalala at pinaka-significant ng time niyo?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there is a kind of a gap between national policy and the classroom. So for example, when I was in elementary school and high school in Manila, the community school movement was never really felt. And I suppose the movement was really more intensively implemented in the provinces rather than the cities. Because in Manila, I suppose there was really very little opportunity, very little incentive for that matter, for teachers to go out and teach nutrition, health, sanitation, etc., because we were already fairly advanced. So in answer to your questions, and at least on the basis of what I know, the most significant contributions were probably two. Number one, he carried forward, or the education system at that time, carried forward the momentum of rehabilitation, Philippinization, the commissioning of new books, new teaching material, the improvement of the normal schools, etc. This is a continuing process, and it was done it was continued during those years. And the second one was the community school movement, which was a great innovation. It eventually took root, and you might say resulted in the full-blown governance system that we have now of local government units, the barangay system.
Okay. So, next question. Okay. Okay, ayun, si Kuya. Okay. Paki-state ang name sa institution or year.
Good afternoon, Sir. Domingo Adolfo from 310 Business Social Science, Faculty of Behavioral Social Sciences. Sir, my question is, if Elpidio Quirino will be the president today and having the educational system today, does Elpidio Quirino will sign the K-12 system that we're having today?
Sorry, I couldn't, the acoustics are not that good here. Can you repeat the question, please?
Slowly daw. Okay po. If Elpidio Quirino will be the president today and having the educational system as K-12, does Elpidio Quirino will sign as the same president Benigno Aquino did?
Well, first of all, I don't know President Elpidio Quirino that well. And so I cannot read his mind in terms of what he would have done. And secondly, neither do I know President Benigno Aquino, second ba o third? Third. And so I can't read his mind either. But in terms of the, so, you know, I mean, I cannot speculate on both, two elements all at once. But if you were to ask me what I think of it, I would think that in principle it's okay, but it depends on the implementation. If the additional 2 years were simply to cover the same material, only extended over a longer period of time, then the only advantage would be presumably that students would be given a little more time to absorb the same kind of knowledge. And so to me, if that were to happen, the impact would not be too great. On the other hand, if the additional 2 years, for example, to enrich the existing curriculum and make it comparable to what is happening in Singapore na lang, then definitely there would be a great advantage to it. But that takes a lot of doing. The first thing you need to do is to improve teachers. And perhaps I should ask you this question. As an aspiring teacher, do you think that you are as good as, let's say, an average Singapore teacher in terms of knowledge of the subject matter, technique of teaching, etc.? You can answer that better than myself, but this is probably the question that have to be addressed. How is it going to be implemented, and who are going to implement it?
Okay. So,
Okay. Good afternoon, Dr. Laya. I am Christian Macwane from BSc History, Faculty of Behavioral and Social Sciences. So I have two questions. The first one would be, since the discussion was mainly focused on the curriculum and on the students, I would like to ask, how was the compensation for the teachers? How was the situation of the teachers in the public education system by the time of President Quirino? Were they, since we know that that was a time of post-war reconstruction, was the compensation for public school teachers sufficient to correspond to their needs? And then my second question would be, if we could compare the education system, the post-war education system of the Philippines during the time of President Quirino, or perhaps immediately after the war, was it still advanced compared to our neighbors in Southeast Asia and perhaps in the Far East Asia? Thank you.
Okay, well, I really don't know the facts on both of your questions. But what I can say is that during those days, the teaching profession attracted good people, and they could make a good living out of it. And so I believe that their compensation was comparable to other professions. During those times, there were already more women teachers than men, which gives you an idea that maybe men went into higher paying occupations, but still and all, the pay must have been okay because it attracted quite a few good people. The choice then, the courses of choice among women at that time, if I'm not mistaken, was really education and to a lesser extent pharmacy. They attracted great numbers of people, and they attracted people who were relatively well off in economic status, and they were highly regarded. So whatever compensation they got, they also added psychic income, the satisfaction of being a teacher. So that's my comment with respect to your first question. With respect to your second question about the comparability of the Philippine education system vis-a-vis our neighbors, I believe it was. And my basis for saying so is really the number of, for example, Indonesians, Malaysians, Thai, that were in school with me in graduate school abroad. There were hardly any. At Stanford, there were quite a few Filipino foreign students when I was there. I believe I knew one Indian. At Georgia Tech, there was one Korean. But, in terms of Thai and the others, they were not there. So to answer your second question, I think that we were more than comparable with respect to the education of our neighbors at that time.
We can still accommodate one more question. So, are there any more questions? Okay.
I think one advantage, by the way, that our pre-war system had was because of the Thomasites. They were idealistic, well-trained, etc., and they were able to impose discipline. In our culture, we don't mind being, held up to our faults by a foreigner. Whereas, if it were one of our colleagues who tell us that, you're wrong, you shouldn't do that, we take it personally. And so I suspect that if the boss is a Filipino, discipline tends to be more lax. And already in the post-war years, most of the American teachers either went home or had already retired. In fact, I know of only two Thomasites who were in the school system during the Quirino administration. One was Gilbert Perez. He was the director of Bureau of Vocational Education. And the other one was Miss Alvesa Stewart, who was the head of the Home Economics section. I remember the names because all of them were, Mr. Perez was an old bachelor, and Miss Stewart was an old maid. And during the superintendent's convention, I tagged along during the superintendent's convention. They were teased mercilessly, so I still remember the names. Yes.
Barry Sullivan. I'm with the Museum Volunteers of the Philippines. I'm a retired high school teacher of 32 years, so looking at all the students here today reminds me of me about 35 years ago. A follow-up question on the Thomasites. If your father was giving the Thomasites grades a report card on their insights and their efforts over the period of time that they were here from the turn of the century on to when they started to phase out, as you said, what type of grades would he give them?
Again, I really don't want to speculate, but I suspect they would have been given high grades because they were single-minded. They, again, being foreigners, they were less likely to be subject to, let's say, political or parental pressure. And they would be able to resist more easily pressure from the outside. So in other words, I'm speculating really. I would suppose that they would be more able to maintain standards than would a purely local guy. Yeah, but that's my feeling. Okay, so thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Laya. May I call on Attorney Aleli Angela G. Quirino, President Elpidio Quirino Foundation, for her closing remarks and some tokens from the National Historical Commission of the Philippines for Dr. Laya.
Thank you, Dr. Laya, for sharing with us your precious time and vast knowledge on the public educational system in the Philippines. I truly enjoyed the trip down memory lane, grade school, high school, college. It is very rare that we have speakers who speak out of actual experience and from the heart. You could feel it, didn't you? Yes. Your lecture was, I'm sure, enlightened all of us here on the continuing impact of education in our lives. I'm sure the teachers and the young students here present have been inspired to become great teachers who will mold our young countrymen into the likes of Chief Justice Davide, Prime Minister Virata, and our forefather, President Quirino. So in our language, we like to say it's our national language, Dios te agnina. Thank you again. We would like to present to you a gift. It is a painting done by Marisa Gonzalez, the youngest sister of Ruby. She is an accomplished painter. She paints oil on husi. So can we open it, please, June? Okay. Yes. So thank you again. We hope that this will find a place in your gallery. Okay, thank you. I think Ruby would like to say something. I hope I don't fall off the stage.
To my good friend, Dr. Laya, I call him for short Jimmy Laya. We have known each other for many years, more especially his wonderful late wife, Alice Laya. I cannot begin to thank you enough, Jimmy, for the wonderful effort that you've done. Mr. Laya is a very busy man, and to come here, really, all of you, let's join me in giving him a big, big hand of appreciation. Sana sa inyong lahat maging modelo itong mga produkto ng panahonan ni Elpidio Quirino. Yung mga tinatawag na mga guru, not only literally teachers, but they are really instructors in the University of Life. And I think as we search for new leaders in the next few years, months and years, we should look to the likes of these people. Hindi kailangan mag-dynasties. I'm also proud to tell you na ang President Quirino is one of the few presidents without a dynasty. So we look for leaders such as Dr. Laya and the examples he put. We bring out the best. You are my grandfather said, you are the light. You are the first light in the community. So kung kayo, as you read the Bible, you should be the walking Bible. As teachers, you should be the light where all of your students can get that aspiration, that then get that idealism. We cannot afford to be sarcastic, ganun lang ang buhay. It's more than a swipe, it's more than a selfie. I think that we should really bring out the best that the Filipino can offer, like the likes of Dr. Laya. Thank you. Mabuhay tayong lahat.
Low. Okay, this concludes the third lecture series on 125th birth anniversary of President Elpidio Quirino, initiated by the National Historical Commission of the Philippines in partnership with the Quirino Foundation Incorporated. Thank you very much.